Welcome to another week in politics with Michelle Grattan. My name's Mark Evans and I'm Director of the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis and your host for this morning's conversation. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Mark.
As you've probably noticed, the sort of political focus of attention in the media at the moment is still on the Trump roadshow.
We can't top that.
No, not really. Not in terms of the latest allegations around Russia. So it's been quite slow this week in Australian politics. So we thought that we'd take this opportunity to look forward to the Super Saturday by-elections. As you know, my team and I have been in Mayo this week, asking local constituents about their views on the candidates and the politics of Mayo. So it would be an interesting opportunity to get your insights into the by-elections, but particularly Mayo, because in many ways Mayo is a barometer. So I wanted to begin by asking you really to provide us with your insights into the political context underpinning the Mayo by-election and why Mayo is such an interesting by-election.
Well, of course, a lot of the attention has been on Longman and Grattan, because that's where you get a government-Labor contest, and that's important for all sorts of obvious reasons. But Mayo is quite fascinating because here you've had a Liberal seat captured by a crossbencher at the last election, Rebekha Sharkie, who was part of the Nick Xenophon team, now called the Centre Alliance, and missing, of course, Nick Xenophon, who's gone into the shadows after the South Australian election. And the big question on Super Saturday in Mayo will be whether the Liberals can get back this seat. Now, when the election was announced, the by-election was announced, it was thought that the Liberals had a very good chance. Georgina Downer, the daughter of the one-time member for Mayo, Alexander Downer, who was of course Foreign Minister for a very long time, is the Liberal candidate, and the expectation was that even though she's been living in Melbourne, she'd be welcomed back, embraced by this electorate. But the polling and indeed the focus groups that you conducted have all suggested that Rebekha Sharkie has really dug into this electorate, and while we have of course still a week to go, so far she's travelling very strongly, and the Liberals are privately conceding that this is going to be very, very hard to get back.
So let's wind the clock back a little bit. Why do you think Sharkie won last time round?
Well, the Liberal holder of Mayo, Jamie Briggs, who'd been a minister, had lost his front bench position because of a personal indiscretion, and I think that people just felt that they didn't want to re-endorse the Liberals, that they'd been taken for granted, that their member had performed badly, and therefore, you know, they were saying no to him. Yeah, this came out very, very clearly in our focus groups. For many people of Mayo, sort of Jamie Briggs sort of encapsulates that notion of the untrustworthy career politician. In contrast to Sharkie, who was local, passionate about local issues and very community minded. So Briggs was almost viewed as an outsider in his own constituency. Yes, and when he was no longer a minister but still wanting to hold the seat, I think people were just fed up. So which candidates do you think are, obviously Sharkie, we can talk a little bit more about Sharkie is capturing the public imagination, but why do you think she in particular is doing so well? I think she's worked the electorate well. She's seen as approachable and sympathetic, empathetic, if you like, to the people there, and again that came through in your work this week. And also, of course, it's a two-horse race. Labor hasn't any chance, so she's being contrasted with Georgina Downer, who is seen as an outsider and a bit a born to rule mentality. Now, she may not have that mentality, but I think that that's how she's perceived by quite a few voters in the electorate.
Yeah, and perceptions, as we know, are everything in politics, I think.
Well, when you're asking for votes, they are.
Yeah, I mean, kind of a quotation that sort of summed up this was that that Rebekha Sharkie is present and Georgina Downer isn't, and it's as simple as that.
Yes, and it is a part of a wider phenomenon, I think, that it's very hard for crossbenchers to get into the House of Representatives, but when they do, they can be quite hard to get out again because they do seem to have this rapport with their local community, and people feel that they might be disillusioned with politicians generally, but this is our man or woman in the seat and they're championing our cause, and therefore they're likely to stick with those crossbenchers.
Yeah, there's kind of a common narrative emerging here across a number of seats, isn't there, around the rise of the crossbencher? And I know that you're going to be talking about this in your column this week. It seems to have moved forward from drawing lessons from Cathy McGowan and others.
Cathy McGowan and Andrew Wilkie, of course, holding a Tasmanian seat, they do seem to be able to establish themselves quite well. And of course we had Tony Windsor for years and years in New England. Now in 2013 he didn't stand, and if he had stood I think he would have been defeated, but that was because he'd identified with the Labor government, supported the Labor government and come from a conservative electorate, and they didn't see him, I guess, as independent enough, but they did support him for many years.
They seem to be tapping into this phenomenon, which again we found in our focus groups, of declining trust in political parties and political institutions. We asked our focus group members to tell us whether they thought that their politics had become more extreme as they got older. And what they said was that, well, it depends what you mean by extreme. If what you're asking is, are we becoming more demanding of our local MPs? Have we got higher expectations for their behaviour? Do we feel passionate about our communities and the future? Then the answer is yes, we are becoming more extreme. So there seems to be an interesting phenomenon there that links a more active citizen to declining trust in our mainstream politicians and political parties.
And another take on this is the old adage that all politics is local. So they are concerned with people who promote their interests, their local interests. There's a bit of a paradox here, of course, because except when the Parliament is hung or close to hung, a crossbencher really can't deliver like a member of a government can. So you saw, for example, in the case of Tony Windsor, when he was pivotal to the Gillard government, a whole lot of resources were poured into that electorate. But when a crossbencher is not really relevant to the wider political scene, then their electorate can be quite neglected, unless they can make a strong personal case for this or that they want. And you do see this in some cases. For example, Cathy McGowan, I think, has very good relationships with ministers and the government generally, so she can make representations and get something for her electorate.
Yeah, I mean, again, our participants in focus groups were picking up on this. They were actually saying, well, actually, we're acting tactically here. You know, if you're in a constituency with a large majority, people just don't take you seriously. If we make the constituency competitive, right, and we get the constituency in a balance of power situation, we're going to get more for our community. And in general, they kind of view South Australia as outside the glare of the political elite, and that this is one way of getting resources to their communities.
It's interesting too in the by-elections where the government and Labor are fighting so hard in Longman and Grattan, the promises that are being made by both sides there, it's astounding. Tens of millions of dollars are being promised by the government and by Bill Shorten in the event of a Labor government later. So the money follows the votes.
It does, but it's also interesting that local political organisers from the big political parties seem to be a little bit out of touch with what's going on with the mood of opinion in those communities. So, for example, they still use very traditional techniques like flying in. Julie Bishop and John Howard was on the plane that I was on going over to Mayo, and again the people in the focus group said, well, they're not here to talk to us, they're here for the media, right? And what they have to understand, it's us that they need to talk to, it's us that they need to engage with, it's our votes, it's not the media who's going to decide the outcome of this election. So it's quite interesting that very traditional methods for increasing votes in these communities are still being used.
And the Liberals at the moment, in these last days of the campaign, are running a very negative assault on Rebekha Sharkie. Now, I wonder about how effective that is, because if people are liking her and identifying her, how will they feel about her being bashed up by the Liberals? So it is very interesting and hard really to campaign against independence, because the Liberals will say, well, what else do we do? Yeah,
well, when we asked locals about their thoughts on negative politics, they thought it was, I quote, appalling. For example, they were very, very critical of Tony Abbott's approach to politics, and also Bill Shorten's approach to politics. They viewed them as basically negative politicians that weren't presenting a vision for the future, that were just there to tear down other people's ideas. They even used the word adversarial politics. This is the first time I've heard this in focus groups, that they're fed up of adversarial politics. They want to see more cross-partisan problem solving on the big problems that are confronting their communities and Australia, which I thought was really interesting. The actual language that was being used is changing very significantly as well.
Well, and the politicians, of course, can't or won't catch up with these trends.
Yeah. So what do you think political parties need to do now to rebuild trust with this type of community?
I do think they need to change their language, their approach, try and reduce the negatives and accentuate the positive, as they say. But at this stage, there's not much sign of that happening.
Well, we presented a number of options for reform to the community, and they combined reforms to make politicians more accountable locally with reforms to enhance participation in policy making and government. And what was interesting is that they didn't choose one or the other, they chose a mixture. It was interesting that the majority, for example, believed that politicians should have free votes in Parliament and should be less disciplined by political parties. They believed that there should be more internal party democracy, in which the interests of local communities were emphasised over the interests of the national party in recruitment terms. They emphasised the importance of more citizens' juries. They liked the postal vote, but they wanted it to be more digital. They couldn't understand, why are we paying all of this money when we could have done this online for a fraction of the price? And interestingly enough, they thought, the majority thought, about 58% to 60% thought that dual citizens should be able to stand for election. And they spoke quite openly on the basis that, you know, if you don't allow dual citizens to stand for election, and a whole range of different groups aren't represented in Parliament, then you've actually got a very small pool of Australians. I mean, calculated roughly about 28% of Australians are actually eligible to stand for election. So some ideas there.
Well, certainly they're thinking outside what is the national political box at the moment, I think.
So a last question for you, Michelle. Do you think that this might be the beginning of a process in which political parties will no longer be the focus of our political system? Or do you think this is just a hiccup?
I think we're a long way from political parties not being at the centre of the system for all sorts of practical and organisational reasons. But we are seeing, and have seen, of course, the erosion of the major political parties. They're still strong, they still dominate the House of Representatives, most obviously, but in the Senate we've seen the increasing power of the crossbenchers, with the negatives that sometimes brings, which I guess reflects back more positively on the major parties. But I think that the system is being disrupted, but the future of it is, the long-term future of it is still evolving, is not yet clear at all.
Thank you, Michelle, and I look forward to reading your piece on Mayo later on today.
Thanks very much.
Well, that brings us to the end of another week in politics, but do click in next time, next week, for another conversation with Michelle Grattan.